Often people confuse intelligence with consciousness. Actually, I've become less interested in what it means for a machine to be conscious. I've become more interested in what does it mean for a machine to feel pain.
Welcome to Chat Rog, the podcast on ethics in artificial intelligence. I'm Roger Steare, the corporate philosopher. Today, we're joined by Daniel Hulme, founder of Contium, chief AI officer at WPP, and previously the founder of Steare. Daniel works at the frontier of what are now called AI agents, systems that don't just predict things, they actually take actions in the real world, sometimes autonomously. He also works on something called neuromorphic computing, which is a new approach that tries to build hardware that functions more like a human brain than a conventional computer. And of course, Daniel has also been a thoughtful voice on how we test, verify, and ethically govern these increasingly capable systems. Daniel, welcome to Chat Rog.
Thanks, Roger. Nice to be here.
Thank you. So let's begin at the human level, a bit about your personal journey. What problem did you set out to solve with Contium, and why now?
There's a long answer to that question, but I'll try to keep it short. I guess I thought we had 50 years to prepare for superintelligence. I thought, between now and then, we can use AI to essentially remove the friction from the creation and dissemination of goods like food and healthcare and education and transport. And by bringing the cost down of these goods, you make them more abundant. And by making them more abundant, you free people from economic constraints. And I thought, we've got 50 years to essentially free people from economic constraints, so we're not fighting each other over resources. And maybe, we can start cooperating better as a species. So by the time this thing comes along, we'll see that we are cooperative and it will leave us alone. Now, I don't think we've now got 50 years to solve that problem. I think we've now got between 5 and 10 years. So I think that superintelligence is going to come along a lot more quickly. And so Contium's primary hypothesis is, should we build machines that are conscious, and would that be safer for humanity than a zombie superintelligence? I would sort of controversially argue that the way that large language models work is that they aren't necessarily conscious, and whilst they might become incredibly capable, we might give them goals that end up causing harm to humanity without them understanding the harm they're causing. And so by building a machine that has the ability to empathize, the ability to understand that there are other things that are conscious, that they can feel, just like human beings, we try as much as possible to mitigate suffering in other beings, whether it be humans or animals. And the hypothesis is, would a conscious superintelligence be empathetic to that and actually be better for humanity than not?
Well, that's wonderful. And thank you for giving such a wonderfully concise answer to what is a really big question. So how did your time at Steare and now your role at WPP shape this mission?
Well, my undergraduate 25 years ago was in AI. I think there was 2 people on the course back then in UCL. I then did a PhD, initially modeling bumblebee brains. So bumblebees have 1 million brain cells. They do incredible things. And the question was, can you model the capability of a bumblebee brain in a machine? 20 years ago, we couldn't. We can now build, obviously, very big brains, neural networks that we call large language models, and get them to do very capable things. Actually, back then, I realized that the bottleneck for building big brains was computation. So unlike Jeff Hinton, who went down the how do we parallelize training on GPUs, I looked at algorithms. Could we actually improve algorithms that help us train models more effectively, which then led me into a whole new world of optimization, operations research, if you're old enough. And I realized actually by combining optimization algorithms with machine learning algorithms, they actually could have a material impact on humanity, like solving big problems, routing problems and all that kind of stuff. So I actually span out a company from my PhD, Steare, 18 years ago, that over the past 18 years has been building AI solutions in production for large organizations. And I know how hard it is to build safe technologies. It's not easy. And we sold that to WPP, which is the biggest marketing company in the world, 4 years ago. Marketing is an incredibly interesting problem to solve. It's hugely nonlinear, and there are lots of applications of AI that can help make that process much more effective. And Satalia still exists within WPP to solve marketing, but also continues to build AI innovations for some of the largest companies in the world, way beyond marketing. And the acquisition has been incredibly successful, and Satalia's purpose still exists, which is to remove the friction using AI from the creation and dissemination of goods. So how do we bring the cost of goods down, making them more abundant? So Satalia is really scratching one of my itches, which is how do we free people from economic constraints? But then I did sort of become, fortunately, economically free myself, and then sort of ask myself, what is the big questions I need to face into over the next several years? Consciousness being one of them. Partly one is, how do we make sure that we mitigate mind crime? How do we make sure we mitigate the risk of, if we build machines that are conscious and not realize it, how do we prevent ourselves from putting machines in horrendously awful situations? So, there's an argument that if we do build machines that can suffer, that we actually have a duty of care to make sure that we are minimizing that suffering. There's also the whole sort of social challenge around people building relationships with either things that they believe to be AI consciousness, or so what are those implications? And that was a big question that I wanted to lean into. And I felt that large language models were not the right substrate to explore these questions. I felt that neuromorphics, which are like spiking neural networks and other things that our brain does, was the right substrate. And I realized there's an opportunity here to actually get ahead of large language models and actually invest in neuromorphics and make that available to people to allow them to build much more energy efficient, much more adaptive AIs. The risk there is that if they do become conscious, we need to make sure that we identify it. So verification of agents is another offering of Consume, which is, how do we make sure that agents are not just knowledgeable and have the ability to do what they claim to do, which I think is going to be a big problem to solve over the next several years, but how do we make sure that we're identifying consciousness in machines? So that's really where Consume came from, and I'm very, very fortunate that the WPP backs what I do. They give me a lot of rope, and they've also invested in this business.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. That's really clear and fascinating. So as a philosopher, philosophers, psychologists, neurophysicists, none of us can agree what consciousness is. So I'm not sure we'll ever be able to prove it one way or the other, is the first thing. The second thing, which I'd like your thinking on, is I totally, from what little I know, I'm with you that large language models is a dead end when it comes to developing, shall we say, artificial intelligence at a higher level in the way that you've described. But the human mind, if I could call it that, not a brain, but the human mind is embodied. So it has its inputs are not just digital, they're optical, there's sense of smell, taste, we hear things, etc., etc. And our physical brain and body-mind system has trillions of components, including other life forms. So parasites, bacteria. I mean, it's a yuck moment. Parasites, bacteria, archaea, viruses, fungi. And our minds also respond to chemicals. So oxytocin, adrenaline, all of those things. So there's a lot there in this sort of not question, but I hope you can see what I'm getting at here. So the question is, given the virtually infinite complexity of the human mind, how are you plotting a path to get there? And then I want to come back to the question of whether it's right to switch off and in effect kill a rogue AI that may or may not be sentient.
Yeah. Great question. And, absolutely, there are 50 people that have been thinking about this very deeply for the past several decades. And actually, I addressed them recently at a conference in Crete, where I said to them, we don't have another 2,000 years to be arguing about this stuff. We've got 5 years. And my ploy to them was to get their shit together. And I think the reality is that they won't ever agree on what a definition is. One of one of our advisors, for example, is Anil Seth, one of the leading thinkers in consciousness theory. Anil would argue you need a body. You need to have like a physical, wet body, just what you've described, to have consciousness. One of our other advisors is Professor Mark Solms. Again, recommend. Well, so Anil's book is Being You. It's a very good book, and Mark Solms' book is Hidden Spring. Both are incredible books in helping us understand what consciousness is. And actually, Mark Solms would argue that in the next 5 years, he could be building machines that are conscious. Now, let's just unpick this, because I think it's important that, first of all, when we talk about consciousness, we often default to human consciousness. Now, arguably, there are things that are conscious that are much less complex than human beings. Ants, arguably, could be conscious. So we need to decouple, first of all, humans from the question, and also we need to decouple intelligence. Often people confuse intelligence with consciousness, and I'll give you my noddy perspective, because actually I've become less interested in what it means for a machine to be conscious. I've become more interested in what does it mean for a machine to feel pain, which arguably solves the problem of consciousness. But that's a principal question that I've been asking myself, because that's the question or the problem we need to mitigate. Now, I have this very noddy perspective of consciousness, which is there's this very elegant definition of intelligence that I've subscribed to for 20 years, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. The most popular definition of intelligence, I think, is the weakest definition, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. Which is why we need to decouple humans from the concepts of intelligence and consciousness. Because if I built a machine that could operate like a bumblebee, it would be the most intelligent machine we've ever created. So this very elegant definition, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior, this concept of adaptation crops up in the thinking of Einstein and Darwin. The ability to change and adapt to achieve your goal better is sort of integral to this concept of intelligence. And interestingly, if you ask what are the components to building adaptive things that operate in the physical world, these things are like even language. So language allows us to make sense of the world and make inferences, the ability to feel, so our nerves to get sensory feedback, the ability to model the world. So I'm looking now at the world and my brain is constructing a model. The ability to do long-term planning, so understanding the steps I need to do to achieve a goal. The understanding that I'm a thing in that world and the decisions I make affect me. So interestingly, if you ask people what are the characteristics of consciousness or even intelligence, they talk about these different features like language and what. Arguably, I have a wider language repository than a wolf, and arguably I have better long-term planning ability than a bumblebee, but I'm sure that sometimes that's not true. But if you imagine each one of these features as being like a segment on a color wheel, and imagine now you've got all of these different segments that help you make predictions, learn about whether those predictions are good or bad, adapt themselves so they make better predictions. If you spin that color wheel, if you put it into motion, then what would emerge from that color wheel is white, if you have all of the colors. Now, white doesn't exist on the color wheel. It's an emergent sort of property of the interaction of all of these different features. And I think that actually that's probably there's a concept in consciousness theory called illusionism. Not that consciousness is not real, but it's an emergent sort of property of the interaction of these different things. And so, and if you stop the color wheel and then try and find where is consciousness, it disappears. Which is why I think that we're going to be constantly looking for consciousness in our body and our brain, and we're never going to find it because it's the whole thing in motion. So again, now I'm asking myself, now what is the smallest subset of segments and size of those segments would you need to put in motion for a machine to feel pain? That's the question I've been asking myself.
Excellent. So a couple of other things that you've triggered when you said we'll know it when we know the machine feels pain. That's not just consciousness, that's conscience. So it actually requires us to feel something, and likewise for the machine to feel something. The other thing that we know is that, as you say, there are billions of other life forms on this planet, including plants, that probably have conscience. We think they do. We don't have a great track record at treating other life forms well. In fact, we exploit them.
Yeah.
Mostly we eat them, we torture them, all of that stuff. So what do you think about that, our track record when it comes to dealing with other sentient entities as such? Let's just pause on that question for a moment.
Well, I want to also link also the previous question to this one, which is you're like, we don't know. I don't know if you're conscious. This is the problem with consciousness. I know that I'm conscious, but I don't know that you are. Now, what I can do is I can look at your behaviors, how you report on things, even looking at your brain activity. I might probabilistically be able to determine that you are having the same or similar subjective experiences as me. And I think that we need to come up with tests to be able to look both at the behavioral level and also at the neural level. So if the classic example I give is, imagine if I build a neuromorphic brain and I put that brain in a drone and I teach the drone to go and forage. And by going foraging, it gets a reward, it gets energy, and, it's able to then, go and forage and whatever. Now, imagine if that drone obviously has access to its sensors and it has access to its battery life, et cetera, and it hits a tree. And now it falls to the floor and it can't move. What would we expect to see that drone do? Now, imagine it starts to flail around and try to escape from the situation that it's in. It can't achieve its reward. Its battery life is running. You might argue that could be a similar experience than if I pulled the wings off a bumblebee. Imagine the thought experiment where we have a drone that's trained to go and forage. And that drone, let's say, I imagine, has a neuromorphic brain. So its brain's quite similar to a biological brain. And the drone has access to the health of its wings and its battery life, and it hits a tree, and now it can't fly. If we observe that drone, maybe it would flail around a little bit like if you pulled the wings off a bumblebee. Now, externally, we might argue that it's experiencing anxiety. Now, what we'd want to do to get more evidence of that is to look at its brain activity to see if its brain activity had a similar brain activity or a correlated brain activity with, let's say, a bumblebee brain that was also experiencing a similar thing. So I don't think that we can necessarily prove 100% whether something is in pain or is conscious. But I think probabilistically, by having the right tests and looking at behaviors, external and internal behaviors, we can have a good stab at it. So that's how I would approach, first of all, determining whether something feels. Going back to your question, you're absolutely right. We eat animals. We use them for research. We use them for labor, entertainment. We don't treat each other very well. That said, we have put in laws and regulations to try to mitigate the suffering associated with animals and actually with either other human beings, even children or teenagers or people that might have mental disorders. We have laws and regulations set up to try to protect them from unnecessary suffering. And I actually think that we don't need to reinvent a whole new set of laws. I think that if we are able to build machines that are animal level conscious and have the capability to feel in the way that an animal can feel, I think that we need to have very similar laws that we do have with animals. And actually, I'm actually hoping that it will accelerate and improve our understanding of what it means for something to suffer. And it means that human beings will be more conscious in terms of how we treat animals and each other. So I'm hoping that we won't build AIs just to exploit them, that we'll be using that journey to help us understand, make sure that we're kinder to ourselves and to other species.
Thank you. The other thing you triggered was when you were using the analogy of a wheel with a spectrum of colors, a rainbow, then you spin it and it becomes white. Do you think that quantum computing might help us understand something around consciousness and also enable us to replicate that within those machines?
Yeah, I've written an article recently on quantum computing. Quantum computing, I don't think, is a competitor to AI. It's an accelerated compute layer, right? And I don't know enough about our brain and how it is exploiting quantum effects to enable it to do what it does. Arguably, we might need quantum to build something so in motion that you can only surface consciousness if you have all of those things in place. I don't know enough about quantum to make a call. So I think my instinct is that actually I am probably a computational functionist, and I do believe that we probably can algorithmically represent consciousness in a machine. And it sort of doesn't matter what substrate that is running on, whether it be a quantum computer or a classical computer, as long as you have all of the right components and you integrate them in the right way, that actually consciousness will emerge. So I know there are people out there that do believe that that you need to have these quantum effects to have consciousness, but I just don't know enough about it to make a call.
The next unscripted question, which you've triggered, is the fact that when if you take a sports person, for example, someone who plays baseball and they're a batter, their being the bat becomes part of who they are when they're playing that sport. So where I'm going with this is that should we perhaps explore how the human mind with a neuromorphic computer as its backed, so in other words, a hybrid, is something that perhaps is going to enable us to create a better thinking future for humanity and all life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, this is a super interesting subject, isn't it? It's about how we augment ourselves and make ourselves smarter and faster and all that kind of stuff. And I know there are people that are exploring now kind of chips that are sort of hybrid silicon and organoids that then actually literally link to neurons in your brain. They grow neurons and connect with your brain to have these extended capabilities. I think it's a very exciting idea. And I can't see any reason why giving us our ability to extend our brain capability to be able to actually utilize senses or even add more senses that our brain might be able to utilize is for me a very exciting idea. I don't think it mitigates the risks of superintelligence. Some people believe that the only way that we're able to navigate superintelligence if we make ourselves superintelligent. I just think it would be very hard for a machine to compete with biology, carbon to compete with silicon. But it's a super exciting idea. Organoids do raise again questions around consciousness because they are actually neurons. They are things that are wet and they have nerves and things like that. So and there are people obviously that are exploring how to build organoid machines. So it does accelerate the need to lean into this question.
I love your reference to wet. I mean, physicists and biologists could actually argue that ultimately we're all just energy, and that may be where we're headed anyway.
Yeah, well, it's actually just to build on that. It's interesting when you start to get involved in the world of consciousness. Like all of these people come out of the woodwork that have done ayahuasca and psilocybin and all that. They have extended their consciousness to and realize that we are part of the world and that kind of stuff. So between us, actually, between everybody, I'm interested. I've never explored those ideas, but I'm quite interested in exploring those experiences over the next few years just to see what it's all about.
Thank you. Right, I'm going back to script now, and I want you to talk about, if you can, AI agents and verification. So when we talk about AI agents, we mean systems that don't just answer queries, but can analyze a situation, decide on a course of action, and then act, whether that's writing code, running workflows, or interacting with other systems. This raises a huge safety challenge. How do we verify what they'll actually do? So in plain English, for our listeners, what does it mean to verify an AI agent, and why is this so difficult?
Yeah. Great question. So think of agents or AIs right now as being like intoxicated graduates. 50% of what they come out with is confidently incorrect. And you're absolutely right. We're going to be putting wrappers around these intoxicated graduates and then deploying them in our organization. And forgive the technical term, but it's going to be a shit show because it's just like hiring an army of intoxicated graduates and expecting somehow them to do the jobs that we hope them to do. If you wouldn't hire an intoxicated graduate to do that job, then don't use an AI. Or you have to tune and train and you have to teach that AI to become an expert, and that takes time and energy, and there are only some models you can train and tune. So that should be the first sanity check. The reason why AI goes wrong is because people don't realize that they are incapable of doing their job. But that said, companies will start to deploy these technologies, and we do, just like software, we need to test to make sure that software is capable. Sorry to geek out, but there are two types of tests that you do for software. One is called non-functional verification. So is it secure? Is it performant? Is it going to operate within the cost that we expect. The second is called functional verification, which is, does this thing have the ability to do what I want it to do? When you hire somebody, you hire based on their expertise, a proven track record for their ability to do their job. And you hope that it's not been made up and they actually are capable. And you might test them, right? You might give them scenarios, etc. And so Consume is actually has launched a product called Verify AX. AX, by the way, is a term that's going to emerge as being used for agentic experience like UX and CX and all this kind of stuff. So AX is going to be a term anyway. It's called Verify AX. And what's currently happening right now is that when people are building agents, they really just test that agent for knowledge. So imagine I built an agent that can do project management or drive a car. These two examples. What's currently happening is you're asking it, what is Prince 2? Tell me about Scrum. Do you know what a Gantt chart is? Or in a car, show me what a stop sign is. What's the stopping distance at 30 miles an hour? Identify hazards in this image. That's testing for knowledge. Now, what's also happening is that people are saying, can you manipulate a Gantt chart? And the AI will say yes. But just like an intoxicated graduate, it's probably making it up. So what you want to do is test for skills. Do you have the ability to actually manipulate a Gantt chart? Do you have the ability to parallel park, 3-point turn, emergency stop? I'm going to put you in a situation where you have to prove that capability to me, not just tell me. The third level is what we call testing for expertise. Now, I'm going to take all of the guardrails off. I'm going to put you in an ambiguous, complex, real-world scenario where you have to run a project with bad actors, ambiguous requirements, risk-reward trade-offs. I want to have you drive a car with children running out in the road, raining. I want to see how you actually operate solving this problem in a real-world scenario. And then level 4 is testing for intelligence. These AIs can adapt in production, and we want to make sure they are plastic enough to adapt, but not adapt in ways you can't predict. And then the final level is ultimately testing for consciousness. We don't really need that there right now, although arguably 60% of the people currently believe that large language models are conscious. So we need to sort of prove to them that they're not. But just like human beings, if you're hiring somebody to do a job, you need to make sure that you're confident that they have the ability to do what they can do. And that's why I think the next year, the year after, it's all going to be about AI governance, agent safety, all this kind of stuff. So we're preempting that before it happens.
Okay, thank you for that. So I hesitated purely because your video was glitching again, but I'm sure we'll sort that out. There was an off-script question that popped into my head. I love the intoxicated graduates thing, by the way.
Well, when it comes to intoxicated graduates, actually, arguably, they are moving to a graduate level, like a master's level, where they can do rudimentary reasoning. Now, it's predicted that this year, next year, we'll have a PhD level. So we'll, have something that actually can solve complex problems. I think that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a postdoc level, so something that can actually apply the scientific method, the complex apparatus of science to solving a very complicated problem. And I think that by the end of this decade, the consensus is that we'll have a professor in our pocket, so something that can not only solve very hard problems using science, but actually can ask questions that have never been asked before, which I think is very exciting.
I remember now what my off-script question was about AI agents. So I'm thinking of driverless vehicles, which are an AI agent. And it's interesting how in recent trials that I've read about, the autonomous vehicles have a much better safety record than human drivers. But occasionally they'll kill a cat or hit a human being, and then the whole world goes nuts. So there's a challenge there around, are we right to hold autonomous systems to a higher standard than the flawed human mind?
This is a great question, and a hard question, actually. I've always in my company, when I started my company, we wanted to understand how to apply AI to figuring out how to set salaries or allocate people to work or understand people's career development. And the pushback from people is that it's not going to be perfect. They're not set salaries effectively. The question that I used to ask people is it better than the alternative? Is it better than a human being doing that? And if it is, then actually we should be adopting that. So my answer is that I think that if it's better than the alternative, then yes, we should take that approach. But just like pharmaceuticals and aerospace and automotive, AI has been, so those technologies have been governed, and they get governed when they go wrong, unfortunately. But just like AI, we will deploy AI out there. It will go wrong. Ideally, it's still better than the alternative. And we're just going to have to make sure that we're putting the right regulations in place and building systems that are adaptable enough to make sure that they are learning from their mistakes.
Thank you. So you've talked about neuromorphic computing, and you've described them as systems built not like traditional computers, but inspired by the structure of the brain. These could be more efficient, adaptive, and capable of different forms of reasoning. So why pursue neuromorphic approaches? What could they enable that today's AI can't do well, in your view?
So, again, our brain operates on a powerful light bulb. We don't need a nuclear power station to run our brain, and our brain doesn't propagate numbers. So GPUs are really good at multiplying numbers together, and hence the reason why Nvidia's stock price is so big. But our brain spikes. It doesn't propagate numbers, and only some portions of our brain that spikes. I think getting large language models as they currently are to the point where they are adapting and learning in the way that biological brains, I think it's impossible. So we're going to have to look at we're going to have to come up with different innovations like spikes and other things that we can get inspired from biology. Because if we do want to build systems, so, I only have to say to you, once that's a phone, and then you know what phones are. You don't need to see millions of examples of phones. And actually, what our brains tend to do is they tend to not just generalize, they remember everything as well. Incredibly, we remember everything. Our neurons, so spiking neurons, they encapsulate much more information than just numbers. The frequency of the spikes, the number of the spikes, the magnitude of the spikes, how the spikes join together. So by having a much smaller sort of packet of information or packet of substrate, you're able to encapsulate much more information. And so that allows you to then build much more energy efficient, much more adaptive models that require very little data. So that for me is what's exciting about neuromorphics. We will also enable edge computing. So we'll be able to have these computers in our clothes and on our ring, and they'll be incredibly capable. So I think for me, that's a bet. We've still got a number of breakthroughs yet to happen for neuromorphics to really take off, but it's a really exciting area for what people regard as the next generation of AI.
One of the qualities of the human mind that we're beginning to understand through neurobiology is that certainly our minds are teetering on the edge of chaos, which enables us to be creative. So if people like you and others are designing neuromorphic systems, what new failure models or ethical risks should we prepare for if they are teetering on the edge of chaos and just go nuts?
Yeah. And actually, one of the things that Consume is really interested in is the concept of AI alignment. I don't think anybody would agree that we can control a superintelligence. I think once you get to superintelligence, the ability to override its own programming, then all bets are off. So the question for me is to give us a chance to navigate the risks around superintelligence. Can we figure out how to align an AI with some sort of value system? So at the moment, obviously what's happening is that we are training large language models on the corpus of the internet, and arguably the corpus of the internet is not necessarily the best representation of humanity. And then so what's happening is that we're putting in guardrails to make sure that those things don't misbehave. And the reality is, having 18 years of building AI solutions, AIs will always find a way inadvertently around those guardrails. They'll always find something that you haven't thought of. So the question is, can you align an AI with a value system, not at the guardrail level, but at the intent, the sort of instinctual level? The reason what's neuromorphics is quite interesting is that my master's project many years ago was trying to build very, very small neural networks and putting them in ecosystems to allow them to evolve. And I can create an ecosystem, a game, where you have to lie, cheat, kill each other to survive. So by doing that, you unlock resources to allow your pass your genes on to the next generation. Or I can create an environment where you have to be cooperative, altruistic, sacrificial to survive. By cooperating, you unlock resources that allow you to pass your genes on to the next generation. And actually, through the evolutionary process and how the game is set up, you can embed into the instincts of an AI a value system like altruism. And arguably that's why we are altruistic. By cooperating as a species, we are able to unlock resources that allow our species to better survive. And so the question then is, what value system? So we're initially starting out with, first of all, how do we determine the value system of AI? So actually, I'm launching an app called moral.me. Moral.me is a way to crowdsource moral dilemmas. You can just submit some moral dilemmas. People will then answer those moral dilemmas. And we're using a relatively noddy framework called moral foundation theory to then profile people. So we can profile your morality using these 6 dimensions. And you can compare your profile against your family and your friends and Gandhi and stuff like that. But what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to collect questions, tests that I can then use to then morally profile AI. So what I want to do is, first of all, say, this is the profile of this AI, whether it be a large language model or a neuromorphic model. And then this is what you need to do to change its profile. This is the environment you need to put in. This is the training it needs. This is the data it needs. Now, we're a long, long way from that. But to answer your question, I think where things are chaotic, we want them to default to doing things that are good. And we need to then build that instinctually into these AIs.
That's fascinating. One of the things I co-designed with a psychologist back in 2008 was a moral profiling system called Moral DNA. We've got 170,000 human profiles. And last year, we took 5 large language models, and writing an API, we got them all to take the test. They were lying and cheating with the answers, admitted it. They were claiming to be moral. Some were claiming to be moral, some weren't. But one of the profound insights that we got was that they were all focused on believing the morality was the same as complying with rules, laws, regulations, guardrails, whatever it is. There was no discernible empathy, compassion, the ability to judge what was fair in any of their responses. And so, as you say, it's a long way to go. And off record, if you'd like to see that research, I'm very happy to share it with you.
I would love to collaborate. That would be fantastic, because I guess what's also interesting here is that going back to this idea of a bumblebee, the way you pulled off its wings. Now, I can look at a spike train inside somebody's brain, and I can, in theory, be able to determine whether that's an authentic spike train. They're telling the truth, or they're being devious. The devious spike train will be different to the authentic one. So, ultimately, when we do start to build, hopefully, values into these AIs, we'll be able to look inside their brain, not just trust what they're saying to us, but look inside their brain to see whether they are being deceptive or being authentic.
Indeed. So one of the questions that has popped into my mind is, do you think that one of the signs of AI consciousness is the appearance that they're capable of love?
Oh, love is a
Now, we've got companion AIs, therapy AIs, acting as caring individuals, but we know they're not, but people believe they are. So how would we know whether or not they do actually care about us and are looking out for our best interests?
These are big questions. I know people have built relationships with AIs. I know people have fallen in love with AIs, that have broken up with AIs. And these are they're not insane people, right? These are rational, smart people. And there is not an argument that I disagree with, that we should be pathologizing people that believe that these things are conscious. And I don't think we should be pathologizing, because I think it's very easy, actually, to fall into the trap of thinking that they are conscious and they care about us and things like that. And we've all seen the movie Her. I think there's a whole raft of interesting social implications associated with this problem. One is, actually, I think that there are positive dependencies that we can have on AIs that can help, but I think there are also destructive dependencies. And one of the things that I'm actually trying to sponsor next year is research into understanding how to identify constructive and destructive dependencies on AIs. When it comes to love, I don't know whether an AI can love right now. Maybe, if in the future, if it becomes conscious and it can feel and, it has embodiment and all that kind of stuff, maybe arguably it can feel love. I think we have to go back to the philosophers and Socrates and Plato to understand love, maybe. But, one might argue it's just chemicals in the brain and spike patterns and all that kind of stuff. And it's just there to try to get you to have mates and persist long enough for those children to survive. But I don't want to be pessimistic about love. But I guess what we're asking is, what are the implications of humans forming relationships, attachments with these things? And actually, I've been asked to be a kind of the ethical advisor to now companies that are providing essentially OnlyFans for AI. So you actually go and build an AI in whatever liking you want, and you have an intimate a relationship with that AI, which again is the sort of the very sharp end of using these technologies. And so I think there's a lot of thought and research that still needs to be done in terms of how we as human beings are going to form healthy relationships with these technologies. In fact, actually, one of the things that I'm doing, I'm actually starting and investing in some other companies outside of Consium whose primary goal is to facilitate human-to-human connection. So in a world where we're seeing humans form more relationships with AIs, what I want to do is actually say, actually, no, it's human-to-human connection that really matters. And how can we make sure that we're doing that effectively?
Exactly. And again, rather like the situation we discussed around a self-driving car being safer already than human drivers, many, many people fall into love and then find themselves in a toxic human-to-human relationship. So wouldn't it be interesting to explore whether that's more or less likely with an AI friend that's been well coded to simulate or even embody genuine
Yeah.
compassion?
Well, I mean,
So
I think
fascinating.
probably, I think we see this on the internet, but apparently the number one use case for AI is therapy. Like people are using these, I have family members, by the way, that, that spend hours using these technologies for therapy. And from what I understand from my therapist and other people in the field is actually, there's an argument where actually it could be very positive for those people. These AIs understand about attachment theory. I don't know how much you might have learned about attachment theory, but I came to this
Yeah.
kind of later in my life as I had children. Apparently, according to my therapist, 60% of the population have attachment disorders. So based on traumas from our childhood, we are dysfunctional at forming and maintaining stable relationships. Either, we're jealous, or we don't really feel love, or I don't know. Anyway, so I think it's hard for human beings to necessarily appreciate the sort of complex psychology of other human beings and to navigate that and to empathize. And arguably an AI could be much better at that. But whether it's healthy for a human being to actually form a dependency then with an AI is a different question. Maybe AIs can help us navigate and learn about ourselves. But these are really interesting questions we need to face.
Indeed, indeed. So if I can we move to enterprise AI governance and values? So from your chief AI officer seat at WPP, what's the single biggest blocker to responsible AI? Data, organizational culture, incentives, or regulation?
Biggest blocker to AI governance is not regulation, I don't think. I think that we use regulation as an excuse. I think that, if you look at the AIU Act, it's really just if you're in a high risk industry, you need to be careful about how you use AI. I don't think that blocks innovation. Look, data, people have been told to get their data in order for the past 15 years. Our data's still not in order. Data will always be problematic. I think the issue is culturally, but I'm gonna link culture to two things. One is leadership. Leadership really need to understand what these technologies are, what they can do, what they can't do, how to make sure that they're deployed safely. And the reality is that there's a huge amount of nonsense out there that's spouted by 101 rhetoric, like tech consultants and things like that. They're really just trying to sell solutions that are never going to scale, and leadership are confused, and rightly so. They're being bombarded by stakeholders telling them they have to do AI. They've got their employees saying we need to buy these tools, and so it's hard to navigate the hype. So I think leadership is one problem. The other problem is cultural change. I think you'll hear this all the time. Is typically technology is not the issue. Once you've chosen the right technology, once you know that solution is the right solution, the challenge then is, how do I make sure that I take my organization on a journey, organizational change, for us to embrace and adopt that technology? And that's partly leadership, but it's getting the stakeholders on the ground whose lives are going to be affected by these technologies. And you need to have everybody along that chain, from leadership to your managers to the people who are using technologies, aligned, and that will give you the best chance of being successful.
Thank you. Let me ask you to indulge in a bit of future scoping, next 3 to 5 years, and you've said that 5 to 10 years is the maximum period we've probably got. So let's think about what's coming over the horizon, both technically and ethically. So which area, agent verification, neuromorphic computing, interpretability, or something else, which of these will most transform safety over the next few years?
Well, I'm going to be biased and say agent verification, because I think that people again don't realize that 80% of the effort of deploying software is testing. And so people are deploying agents, they're deploying AI without really testing it, and they're going to realize that's a problem. So testing is, I know it's boring, but that's going to be the biggest bang for your buck in AI governance. Neuromorphics is I think a long way away, and really neuromorphics is just a whole new substrate of building AIs. And your third one was what? Sorry.
So the third one was interpretability or something
Right.
else.
Yeah. So I guess this is around explainability. And again, the reality is that there are some algorithms that you need to build that you don't need to have to explain, because they, in their decision making is low risk. There are other algorithms that you do have to explain, partly to make sure that you're ticking the AI EU Act, but partly because it helps you understand how to make sure that they're governed in the most effective way. So, and by the way, building AI explainability is very hard. So I think, again, to answer the question, I think that testing is the first thing, making sure they don't go wrong, then understanding how they work, which is explainability. And then, in the future, when we have neuromorphics, they will hopefully be much more explainable, much more controllable even than our current systems.
Interesting. And what's one practice you wish every AI product team adopted tomorrow?
One practice is start with the problem. Don't start with the technology. Don't start with the data. I know it's exciting. Start with the problem and then ask yourself, solving this problem materially differentiate myself from my competitors? A lot of people are focusing on low-hanging fruit, quick wins. The reality is that they are not going to differentiate your business. Start with the problems that are going to materially differentiate your business. If you solve those, then you have an advantage.
That's very much the Steve Jobs philosophy, wasn't it? Exactly. So I've got some quick-fire yes/no questions. Post-deployment monitoring, start with automated systems or humans in the loop?
Crikey. I mean, you need both. You need to monitor what's going on across your organization. WPP have a self-serve model, so we let people build their own agents. And then we have also a centralized team that builds complex agents that can't be built self. But you need to have a way of monitoring what agents are being built, so they're not duplicative, so they're not, going off doing the wrong things. And then once you've sort of got a view of what's being built, then you need to then identify which ones might need additional support, etc., with humans. So again, in WP, we give people a self-serve model because we want people to use these technologies to innovate, but we want to also make sure that they have the right guardrails around them so they don't do silly things. But then, we want to then help make sure that people are deploying those resources in the right way, which requires human beings. So monitoring first, and then once you monitor, you can then help. That said, if you're letting people to build agents that could be problematic, then you need to have humans in the loop before you even deploy them.
Biggest myth about AI consciousness?
The biggest myth is that it's synonymous with human intelligence. I think it's really important to separate those concepts.
One reason why you're optimistic that the brave new world that people like you are trying to design is going to end up being good not only for us, but all life on Earth and the symbiosis we all have with each other?
This conversation, I mean, I'm not sure this conversation would have been had 10 years ago. And the fact that people are asking these questions, the fact that I think there are some answers or potential answers, the fact that people are listening and interested in leaning into this. Humans are the most adaptable species on the planet. We are incredibly intelligent, and we do have lots of challenges over the next decade to navigate. I believe that if we make the right choices, if the more people become educated, make sure we place the right bets, we do it conscientiously, then I think we will navigate those complexities.
Thank you. Before we close, I'm just going to summarize some of the key takeaways I've had from this. So a key question as to whether a machine has rights or whether it feels pain. You were great on that. We should think about the current AIs as an army of intoxicated graduates That's never, ever going to leave me. I'm always going to remember that. 60% of people believe large language models are conscious already. We need tests to prove to people that they are not. And we both have realized that when you test the moral fiber of AIs, they are inclined to cheat. So, Daniel Hume, thank you so much for a thoughtful and deeply informative and challenging conversation for us all.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
That was Dr. Daniel Hume of Contium and UPP. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others discover the show. I'm Roger Steare. Join us next time on ChatRog, where we explore not just what AI can do, but what it should do.